Hi, welcome today. We have a couple of interesting guests for what I think is going to be an interesting topic. We're actually one short at the moment, but I think he's on his way. So, what we're talking about today is something related to what we did last week, which is kind of all about local and the thing. And today we're going to focus a lot on the grains. And we have basically the terroir of the grains mainly, and then maybe talk as well about heritage grains and what's being used. And we have I see coming in here Morris as well. So we have with us some very knowledgeable guests. We have, if you excuse me, I have to show Morris here. So we have Angelita Hynes from Waterford Distillery, who is the terroir expert down there. And I suppose you could talk yourself, Angelita, but I mean, Waterford are well known, or what they're known for is using basic terroir on whiskies, using single farm, single malt whiskies to to brew the whiskies, and then for let the malt come through. And we also have here just joined us Morris from Canvas Brewery in Tipperary. For those who don't know, Morris was here before, but I suppose you still call yourself a farmer first and foremost, and then a brewer. So he set up the brewery basically to use his own ingredients. So he's got a lot of experience as well on the terroir of the grains, what affects basically the local Tipperary landscape has on the grains, and he's also doing a lot of work with heritage grains as well. So I thought it's kind of in a way two different sides of the world. There's distilling and there's brewing, but there's kind of that central grain focus in there. So I thought it could make for an interesting chat. So Angelita, maybe does that sum up what you're doing in Waterford? I know you're doing, like, you were one of the first to do this, I think, were you, to focus on terroir and did a lot of kind of scientific research on it.
Yeah, hi, Brian. Thank you very much for having me in. It's been an absolute pleasure to be invited for your program. Yes, so I am the terroir specialist for Waterford Distillery. We've been doing a lot of sensory analysis and a lot of work, especially before even the grains go in, which are the soil types. And we gather a lot of data, and we've been gathering a lot of data for the past 7 years. So now we can talk about it with so much more assurance of what we are doing. When we started the project, especially on the distilling world, this being is such a new subject and was quite polarized for so many years, and we kind of got a lot of backlash from people around the world, not the believers on terroir and the non-believers. So last year, after 4 years of research, academic research, Dr. Dustin Herb, which I work alongside him, he proved academically that terroir does indeed exist. So now when we talk about terroir, we don't talk about just with our own assurance of our own beliefs, but we have the scientific data to back us up. And it is being just incredible, all the projects that we have in the distillery. And when we talk about terroir projects, it's never just one. It's almost like it's so many projects that we have. It's like moving parts, and everything kind of interconnects to each other. It's like a building block to stages. So on the first research, which was the 4 year research, we focused on two different terroir sites in Ireland. And then we grew grains, and then we were able to see that the terroir indeed did have different expressions on the grain, and therefore in the malt. And that's where when we produce whiskey in the distillery, everything is single farm. So for Morris, for instance, that is a farmer, he will really understand that when we actually have that control and we focus in one farm and we study about all the data that comes out of one farm, it is almost like there's these it's almost like a DNA expression of that land. So the way everything is expressed in terms of what we gather later on, in terms of sensory analysis and analytical analysis, can come true, and we're able to demonstrate that.
And what killed me there was that the bit that you said, like there was a resistance to this. I mean, people accept terroir around, grapes and stuff. Why was there? Why
Yeah,
do people they think it just didn't apply to this? I mean, it doesn't make sense, really.
in a way, I'm kind of lucky now that I don't get that much backlash since that paper is being published. Like, has been a lot of calming down made. Until then, until the paper was released, it was very polarizing. Like, you could have like people from the industry or even people that outside the industry. Some of them really believe and it makes sense and they're like into it, and then there are the people saying, you couldn't, you're going to distill it, you're killing the whole terroir effect. Or but the whole point, the point that it is well accepted in grapes and different kind of food around the world is that grapes, for instance, there's no modification. So when the grain undergo modification, which is the malting stages, therefore we do change the enzymes in order to brew later on. So from that was one very strong argument, which is very plausible, that indeed there is changes within the grain when once you malt. But then we were able to see through analytical analysis, which are lab analysis, they are like chemical, proper, tested, improved, and scientific, that there, even after the modification and after distillation, there is still a very large part of terroir still contained and kept. But everything it goes through the whole processes. For example, like you couldn't say about terroir of a place where there of grains that actually there's no provenance. So therefore we need, when we talk about terroir, first we need to talk about transparency. Everything has to be transparent. The consumer needs to know everything there is about that farm and about that grain and about all the applications that are used, if they're commercial type of farming or the organic, biodynamic, whichever farming processes that you're using, we need to be transparent about it. And secondly, there is the traceability. So in Waterford, we actually have passports for each farm. So when we talk about passports, like we actually have them physically. If you're coming to visit, we can show you the passport for each farm. So we can tell you everything that you need to know. And when I mean everything, I can tell you the day the farmer, what grain was chosen, what type of soil is in that farm, first of all, what is the environment around that farm, what are the type of farming practices that farm has, and then we're going to say what type of grain is growing, what day that went into the ground, how many days that has been grown, when was that harvested, when was that sent to storage, when was that sent to malting, when was that sent to the distillery to be brewed, how long was it being brewed for, how many hours is being brewed, when has been distilled, how many hours distillation has it been, and then and we actually have documents that we from the traceability from each step of the way. And it did sound like a big list, long list here, but it's still there's still much more than that. So by doing that, and then when it's after when it goes into distillation, the distilling methods are crucial because we are not cutting any corners there. We are literally honoring the farm. We are honoring our raw material, which is often forgotten. We talk about beer, we talk about spirits, but often it is a different type of raw material that is being used that ends up having being the crown, wearing the crown, and yeast is often the one wearing the crown. But without the malt, we can't produce these the beautiful beverages that we can have in the end. So in Waterford Distillery, malt, the grain, the barley, and the malt is the king. So therefore, we by knowing every single detail of the grain, we can literally see it its own expression for the farm and the way that grain has been the way it's being looked after and managed. And then once it comes into the stills, there's no point for us just to rush it off. Like our stills can be they're designed to run 3-4 times faster, and we run really low and slow because that's where we're trying to capture every single process that is being up to that point. We are capturing that. It's literally capturing the spirit of that grain and the whole process up to going into maturation, which is a totally different ball game as well, and then eventually getting to your glass.
Right. Right. I'm wondering where to jump in there. Morris, did you have any questions coming out of that? It's an awful lot of
Well,
information that came at me.
well, I think it is interesting when you think about the industry as a whole. And in this whole topic, it's that story. There's terroir in grapes. The French winemakers talk about it's terroir. This is my soil. These are my grapes. This is why my wine tastes like that. And in the brewing industry, we talk about it in hops, whether it's Goldings from East Kent, whether it's, where the hop is grown is very important. If it's Australian hops, American hops, New Zealand, that's very important in terms of what cascade hop it is. And then when you turn to grain, they say, "Ah, no, it doesn't make a difference." And that's that's true when you're talking about someone like Minch or Bortmold. They're taking grain from Donegal, they're taking from Cork, they're taking from every part of the country, and they're blending it together so that they get uniformity. And that works on a very large batch system. They're trying to reduce any variation, you know but that's not to say that terroir doesn't exist. It's because they changed their process to make sure the expression of the grain doesn't come out in their system. And when we were starting up, people were like, "Oh, you're too small. You won't be able to get consistency because you need to have a large batch size to get consistency." But that search for consistency is to try and blend out terroir. So the other side of things I thought was very interesting was just asking brewers, and you're like, terroir, does it exist? And they're like, no, no, don't worry, just buy whatever malt. That's just malt. You don't worry about it. And then you're like, okay, you want to make a really good beer? What do you use? Oh, buy Maris Otter. So like buy a particular variety of grain, a heritage grain, which is grown in a particular part of the UK because it makes the best grain, but
But
otherwise you
it
don't
doesn't.
say there's any difference. Like, it's complete cognitive dissonance. Like, it's like you've just disproved yourself in the one sentence. Like, come on. Like, so that's it does exist. It's very difficult. Like, Waterford have gone to great lengths in terms of being able to exploit the terroir of different farms, and I've gone to great length to try and actually malt our own grain to brew it into a beer on site. It's not an easy journey. You know what I mean? And that's it. But yeah, it's, as a farmer, it's just the most obvious thing in the world. Like, most farmers don't, like, as in terroir exists. Of course it exists. It's just no one cares about it. Or no one used to care about it. But like, I give the example that we farm some fields down by Lough Derg, right? And no matter when you sow it, that will always be ripe first. We don't even, like, really, like, at this stage, we don't really need to check the other fields, because that's the field we check first, because it will. And whatever it is about the stone, the location, the aspect, the lake, it just ripens earlier. And we just know it. And farmers know that's a heavy ground, that's lighter ground. This will affect how it ripens and how that all happens. That's all terroir. And to me, that all ends up in what the grain actually is. It's subtle, yes. It's not smacking you in the face like yeast will, or like hops will, or like barrel aging will. Yes, there's lots of other controls that can make way bigger flavor contributions, but in beer, what they say, the malt is the soul of the beer. So deep down, that's what makes the expression of what that beer is. Do you know? So
Yeah.
that's it's obvious to me, but
Yeah. Actually, just to come back to it, because like when we're talking here about terroir, and especially in Waterford, like you're talking about micro difference, like microclimates, one that's down the road. But was there an acceptance that, say, grain from America was different from grain from Norway, was different from grain from Ireland? Was there an acceptance that there was at least uh, that much terroir before, or was there not even an acceptance of that?
Well, I would say, Brian, the large industry don't want to accept that because they don't want to talk about it because they are importing cheap grain from wherever the heck they can get it, and they want to produce a beautiful Irish whiskey. And I would say the same in brewers, as in I think there's a bit of a dissonance of like craft brewers when they're talking about, hey, this is a local craft brewery, and hey, look, this is a bag of German malt that we're using. And it's like, come on, man. Like you're selling your beer because it's local and then you're importing German malt. Like we have a
Yeah.
great climate for growing barley. Like we should be celebrating those. And in fairness, more people are doing it now. And it's great to see. You know, when you see people saying, this is the field where my beer came from, I'm making a local beer and I'm using local grain that came from there. The more that happens, the better. You know what I mean? Because if you're selling it based on location, you need to also support the farmer and support the local thing. You know, I think that's just such an important, for Waterford Distillery, do we want to be importing French malt to make Irish whiskey?
No, we
Good
don't,
answer.
and we don't do it. Yeah, so when it comes like when we talk about terroir, especially Morris there, he's a farmer, and like for me this is a great example because what we found in our research is that within farms, within that particular microclimate of wherever that farm is, right? We're actually able to, on our academic research, establish that there is actually vintage effects through each harvest. So when I usually, the way we usually present to consumers in diagrams. So it's like a spider diagrams, right? So through sensory and analytical analysis, we can see, how sweet that turned out, or how floral, different kind of notes attributes, and then it kind of has the spikes. And within the same farm, let's say if I get Morris Farm and I place three different harvests, there will be a vintage effect. So what does that tell us? That tells us when we think about terroir as a whole, we think about soil types and the weather, the amount of rain and amount of sun that has been on that year. But it's so much more than that. We have to think of the biodiversity around those farms, and how and to me, what is being this journey as a terroir specialist has been showing me is that the power that the farmers have that as well. There is also an element of farming management. And when you're talking about that particular field there near Loch Derrick, Morris, it just makes total sense to me because some of our commercial farmers, when they started, they were just following processes of commercial. All they wanted was yield, and then once they started to work with us, they understood that there is also an appreciation for their names as a farmer. So there was a lot more effort being put into their crops on the subsequent years. But when it comes to especially the biodynamic growers, because they're just stress free, they're not worried about the weather, they're not be mowing like, oh, this year it's just being so hard, or we had no rain, or we had too much rain. They literally trust the process, and by trusting that process, there's another level of terroir in that, and it's amazing. It's actually quite extraordinary, the expression of the biodynamic growers into the grain. It's just I'm not sure if you had the chance to try our biodynamic whiskey, and it's I mean, some of the notes there, they were like, wow. And this is like in a new make that's not even before it went to maturation, which is a different level as well of how that spirit behaves. So it's just incredible when you look after all those things, and then when the farmer looks after their land and appreciates the insect life or the microorganisms that are under the ground, and doing a lot of work for them as well to produce the best. And that's when the grain expresses everything that is being captured from that particular environment and that farm, and how that is nurtured. um, I often use an analogy for people to understand. especially people that are quite new to terroir, and they are like, okay, maybe they have never even heard about it. But the way I usually present to people, it's like, let's say if you, Brian, have a twin brother, right? So you have the same genetic material, and you were grown in Ireland. You were, one of your parents kept you in Ireland, and the other parent moved to South Africa. So you have the same DNA. Your twin brother would have the same DNA, but then it's going to be reared in a different place and be reared by a different parent as well, even though they carried the same DNA. But then the nutrition that you will be getting here, and that environment and the cultural environment and everything that will form you as a person, and especially kind of, physically, even the way you age will look different. Someone perhaps that has endured more sun in their skin will age differently. So once we think about that analogy, and we think about, the same type of grains growing in different environments, it could even be close enough in terms of location, but that soil will be different, and that climate around there will be different. Like, for example, here in Kilkenny, we have few farmers here, and their grain is just so lush and beautiful. You go to the field and it's lovely and high, and then you go into the likes of Bano Island in the coast, where it is a little island, and it's battered with the wind, and you get so much rain, and the grain grows much lower. Even like the height of the grain is different, and therefore the expressions of those two different grains, they are different. We were proven that they are different. And how do we know that? It's when you, as a consumer, you taste and you can tell the differences. Even if we have made the whole brewing and distilling process as a control, there are differences on the result, and that's when we know that, not only the environment but the farming practices have a huge effect on the grain.
Yeah. No, and how I describe the differences of farming practice is that if you say in a typical rotation, right, you might come from winter crop into spring crop, and that'll be a spring malting barley, right?
Mm.
There's an opportunity there to put in a cover crop, and that is a green manure, a cover crop. It feeds the soil basically, right? And you have to picture one option is you do nothing, right? So that ground sits there from mid July, end of July, until February, March, and does nothing basically. And no soil biology is being fed. Just some birds feed off loose grains and things. Okay. The other option, say what we do, is we put in a 12-way mix of different varieties, which right now is basically flowering. So you have butterflies feeding off the flowers, but that's only on top of the ground. You got to think what's going on below the ground. Those are loads of roots feeding the soil, putting loads of exudates. Now, for a farmer, right, that's maybe €25, €30 a hectare. You can spend up to €50 a hectare on seed, and it's a busy time of year. Why do you invest that money into the soil? It's like I'm doing it for soil health because I also believe the crop from it is going to benefit in terms of yield, but benefit in terms of flavor. So, that's going to be a healthier soil with lots of microbes, lots of worms. Worms are the big guys, you can see them. That's a healthier soil than the one which didn't have a cover crop. So now that's 30 quid, €30 a hectare in seed. But these are all little controls of how you can affect the environment, basically. That's how healthy the soil is. And to me, that transfers into the grain, into a healthier crop, which produces more interesting flavors. And that's just one instance of cover crops. You then have rotation, you got lots of other things as to how you manage the soil and how that produces an effect. Now, here's the thing though, right? And this is why I went down the route of setting up a brewery, because it's like, if I go and take that grain and put it, we trade it as farmers on the world market. No one gives a fiddler's what happened to it. They're like, great story, love it, Mars, butterflies, great, great, yeah, yeah, and that's the price per ton. Do you know what? And that's the way it is. It's just a world market commodity thing. Whereas now, I think what is interesting is now we're kind of moving into an era where people are beginning to say, okay, how was that grain produced? Where is it? Is this grain coming from war torn Ukraine? Like, what is happening? But that's world market and large business. But yeah, no, it's genetics. Genetics is one thing. That same variety grown in different places, different expression based on the soil. And that is, the weather has a massive effect. Each year it's going to be different, but the management, your crop rotation, your cover crops, all those things have effects on
Yeah.
what that grain is, do you know?
Yeah, so that comes back to what you said, Angelita, about the vintage. And is it recognizable? Can you look at a grain from, 4 or 5 different years from the same farm, but know it's from the same farm, even though it's
Yeah.
slightly different?
Yes, we can. Yes,
Huh.
we can. We can see clearly, so we have satellites on kind of on farms, near to the farm. So we collect all the data. We collect the amount of rain. We collect amount sunlight, the direction of wind. All those. I know it sounds a lot of data. If you actually go into the Waterford Distillery website and you go into the terroir code, which is on the back of every bottle. You can actually get the terroir code and have a look. There's so much data that, for people that are anti-data, they'll be like, what am I going to do with that? But this is how, or the lengths that we go into kind of capture everything. And having, by analyzing those data from different years, it gives us a data analysis. But when it goes into the sensory analysis, and this is without, like, their blind samples given to the panelists, like they don't know what they're sampling. And then when we go in and combine that data, we can see just from the sensory analysis on its own how the notes differ. And it's just incredible because even like when it goes into the farmers management, if when farmers seeing that result and they get that kind of for extra quality, and then they could also implement different techniques, like Morris is saying what he does. Maybe another farmers have never cared for that, and then they said, okay, I'm going to give a try this year and see if I feed my soil, or I might even have a little bit of different livestock into that field, which also has different effect on the way the nitrates are fixed on the soil, due to by just, let's say, sheep eating that plant has a different effect, a chemical effect on the soil, which it feeds the soil differently that maybe it wasn't fed before. Like I was in one of the organic farmers a couple of months ago, and there's a field that hasn't used for 5 years for grain, and he uses different type of cover crops in different stages, and that it's just to show that how some farmers, they go through so much lengths to feed their soil. They believe that, they know that the soil is what is going to give them that quality, and that quality is going to be expressed into different flavors when it goes into the grain. And that goes for everything that we use, not only for barley, but in this particular case, when we are looking and analyzing and literally paying attention to those processes, we can actually see the results and confirm that those results exist.
Okay, and that applies as well. I'm guessing now. Like, have you seen from what you're saying there that, like, you've had farmers who were doing very little crop cover and now they're doing lots of rotation, and, like, would you recognize those two as being the same grain, or from the same farm, like from when he started to now,
So
or
at the moment,
is that difference so dramatic?
I am actually starting a small project, which I hope to next year be able to talk more about that. It's just I was visiting a farm early this year, and I realized one neighbor is out, which is also our grower. He is a commercial grower, and the other one is organic grower. So therefore, it's the same terroir. When we send the soil analysis there, it's exactly the same terroir. So I'm actually looking forward to run some tests through the year to see in terms of how those two different soils have been fed due to farming practices, and some of the soils have they just add different type of like nitrogen content and all those to make the plants perform better in terms of yield. but I'm looking forward to see eventually what those results are. So it's like, that's what I was saying, it's an ongoing thing. There's lots of moving parts when it comes to terroir is never one thing. It's not just, we can go into kind of more in-depth details in terms of just the soil itself, or just the farming practices, or type of grains, which for most for all the commercial farmers and organic, they can choose what grain they want to grow, because that's a different ball game. It's being, I was reading your an article about Morris, and I thought it was fascinating. I could Loads of things were running into my mind. If the viewers haven't had a chance to read his story, I definitely recommend. I think especially, his earlier days says a lot about the industry, and how to this day grain is chosen by a big board of people, or what farmers have to grow. And all those things also has an effect. They don't have the say of what grain that could be possibly better for growing that farming, that soil type. They don't have the say, so therefore they just have to go with the flow and grow what's given to them by the Department of Agriculture. And then, but if they had the choice, they would perhaps be able to match into their a more a grain that would be better for that particular soil. But then when it
Yeah.
comes into the biodynamic growers, they don't have to follow that rules. They can grow whatever they want. So once they grow whatever they want, they're happy enough. But also the results are amazing. It just is. Not saying that their farming practices is the way to go. There are just different styles and different ways that suit different type of farming. But there is a, we can see the trend that when, if they could choose, they would probably be leading into a different area, and therefore different type of more flavorsome grains according to their farms.
Yeah, so we'll ping into heritage grain now,
Yeah.
but yeah, so that's the whole idea of that when we started growing grain, the idea of like estate beer, basically that single source, the grain, the water, the hops, everything all from the farm, basically. And it's like, well, if we're going to grow the grain and we're going to go through all of this hassle, let's get the most flavorsome grain possible, right? And that's where the idea of heritage grain came across, because grain has been bred for yield, basically. Once it reaches a minimum threshold, then of protein, it's yield, basically. Yield, yield, yield. Disease resistance is becoming an issue, because basically chemicals are becoming more controlled and there is more disease spreading around. So therefore, disease resistance is important. But conceptually, grains have been bred for us for yield. And that's where, if we go back into heritage grains, it's a much different kettle of fish, because these were grains that could actually survive in the environment for a longer time. And basically, my premise was it's like, well, if Maris Otter is still accepted by brewers as being the most flavoursome malt, and it's a heritage grain, then surely we should go back to these heritage grains to get flavor, because this is a quantity that's never been tested in terms of grain or variety production. So that kind of set me down a rabbit hole of saying, okay, can we go to seed banks? Can we get grains? Can we grow them out for years, see how they work in the environment? See how they work in farming. Like the times that these grains were growing is it's different agriculture. Some of these grains were grown when you didn't have a combine harvester. So like there's all of these other little parameters basically that you kind of got to work with. And but like that's it's cool. Like there is a sacrifice in terms of yield, but it's like what else do you get back? Do you get the flavor side of things? And that's I'd love to do some of the work like what Waterford are doing, get more quantification onto what exactly is the flavor component. And that's you got to do a side by side trial of here's a modern variety, here's a heritage variety grown in the same conditions, and here is the flavor. You know what I mean? Can you taste the difference? And in a way, our nose is a super complicated analysis tool to actually do flavor and smell all these different compounds and figure out what all of these things do. Do you know? Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Can
the
I?
other, like, there's really cool things with heritage grains, and a lot of them typically have much taller straw, right? Which is a challenge in terms of holding up for high yields and stuff like that. But the taller straw has a larger root system. And when you're talking about low input agriculture, when you talk about looking after soil microbiology, soil structure, that bigger root system gives you drought resistance, gives you disease resistance, gets the plant in a happier place with the soil and its environment. And that's where you can start to get expressions of flavors and stuff. Um, so yeah, I love heritage grains
Yeah,
basically.
well, maybe before we talk any more about them, is there a definition of a heritage grain? Like, is it where, or is this just a vague term of like stuff that is not commercially produced? Now, is there
Uh,
any formal definition, just so we know exactly what we're talking about, as much as we
that's a
can?
bone of contention, actually. Heritage grains, generally, there's kind of a line in the sand which is to do with the invention of nitrogen fertilizer, the end of World War II, and Norman Borlaug, and creating dwarf varieties. Because basically, there was a point in agriculture where, and it was developed to basically reduce hunger. It's like, could we increase yield? Could we get shorter varieties? And the shorter varieties, if we provide them nitrogen fertilizer, they can create this huge yield. And basically, fast forward, that's post World War II basically is a line in the sand for me, basically. That after that, varieties started to get shorter. It started to they started to be developed with nitrogen fertilizer in their mind, basically, as can they withstand and can they hold up to more nitrogen fertilizer. And so everything pre that, but then like you can go back barley. Some people would say like you need to go back to spelt and einkorn and these other things to go really old, basically. And that's yeah, it's a spectrum. Do you know what I mean? Whether
Right.
you work with old, whether you work with really old, whether you work with prehistoric, they all have their different niches and their different things,
But
basically.
effectively, since the Second World War, it's been just a handful of types around the world, and all these
Yeah,
other
and,
ones
and
we're working with, and that probably you in Waterford as well, Angelita, that you're now starting to work with,
Yeah, so
is
in
only
in
supplied from
Waterford,
tanks, is it?
we started a project with heritage grains about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So now we have literally resurrected a few heritage varieties that hasn't been grown in Ireland for, like, especially the old Irish hasn't been grown in Ireland for over 120 years. So these is being we were able to grow Old Irish, and these last June was the first time we distilled Old Irish. So it's been I have a very large heritage project happening. So I have a few different grains. I have Hunter, which I believe you also have grown Hunter, Morris. We have Goldthorpe, and we have Old Irish. And like when we look into their, firstly, we had to go to the Department of Agriculture seed bank to get seeds. So we literally, probably Morris know, they give you a little pouch with maybe 5 grams of seeds, and they say to you, off you go. So when we talk about that, people could be there drinking their beer or drinking their whiskey with heritage, made out of heritage grains, but they don't know what goes behind it. It's so much more than that. They literally give us this little pouch and off you go, and you take you years to develop enough seeds for you to have a crop. And then after, like from 5 grams to 25 grams to 100 grams to a couple of kilos, then for you to have enough to grow a crop, for you to have a recipe. Like in for Waterford Distillery, we recipe is 120 tons. So imagine, like, for you to get 120 tons out of a little pouch this size, it takes a couple of years. So there's a lot of effort and a lot of mindfulness that goes into that. And then once that comes out, there's a whole different ball game, because there is those type of grains that hasn't been brewed in so long, so they are problematic. They have they have very low yields from the field. They don't behave well in the brew house. So for us modern brewers that we're here, we could be as passionate about the past as we like, but we brew with modern varieties. So when it goes into you as a brewer to brew that, you can't approach that with the same way as you do with the other grains that are grown every year. So you have to adjust recipes, you have to adjust your mill, the way it's going to be fermented. You have to keep an eye on that. You haven't no, there's no one out there to tell you the exact recipe. You're adapting to the best of your knowledge and your experience as a brewer, and then this is out there on your brew house and you're managing that. And then the way they also usually don't give as much alcohol production, so there's always, you're always kind of being let down in terms of what you're being used to in terms of modern. But then what you're gaining from all these are flavors that hasn't been seen in decades, that none of us have even tasted. So that is it's almost like a nostalgic moment as a brewers, as distillers, and as a drinkers, to see that actually this being rescued from the past. And also this is the way, the time that those grains were grown were the time that farmers used the cycles of the moons, like the biodynamic growers used. They were normal. They weren't called biodynamic farmers, they weren't called organic farmers. That was farming, and that was the way they did things
Yeah.
until
There was
modern.
no such thing as organic back then
There
because there
was
was
none,
no
no such
synthetic
a
fertilizer. There
exactly,
was
because
no pesticides.
everything was organic, and
And
with
and actually I would say it's interesting because it's like, oh, that this heritage grains, it doesn't behave in the malt house, it doesn't behave in the brew house, and it's like, no, it doesn't behave like modern grain behaves. It's just
yeah,
that we're very used to, we've honed our skills onto one certain type of grain. It
exactly.
behaves just fine. It's just it's a different set of rules. You got to change how you behave, how you process it. All of these other things need to change. And that's why we can do it, because I'm farmer, maltster, brewer. I can change all of these bits and understand why it's different, how I need to change the process. But it's the same that happens in our bread. Irish bread makers will
Yeah,
stand up in the radio and say, we can't use Irish bread, we have to import bread. Irish wheat doesn't perform well. It's like, no, it doesn't perform well for your process as you have it now. If you change your process, you can change and you can use Irish grain to make Irish bread, but it might be a different bread and hopefully would have more flavor and nutrition.
yeah,
So these are all it's a mindset thing that we're very programmed to. We need a certain yield, and yes, it probably is more economic. That's most people would say, if I grew a modern variety, I get more yield, produce more beer, and just sell more of it and make more money. Do you know what I mean? Like
exactly.
that's
Yeah. It's for more economical purposes than for flavor purposes. So that's when we go back into the heritage grains. We're rescuing all these that has been lost along the process, and by doing that, some of the grains we have no idea what we lost, because they're not grown anymore, and we don't have access to them anymore.
and what's really scary is that you say, okay, cool, this is an interesting variety. Let's go and get our like 20 seeds. And like my dad was looking, it's like, hey, one of those is cracked. You're down to 19. And you're like, oh. But it's like you got to grow them out for a couple of years, right? To get enough to have a quantity that you can then test and see if it does suit our climate now and it does suit our brewing process. So like it's a huge commitment to go and do it. And it's like each time I go to a seed bank, I'm like, do I really want to go back and go through 5 years to then decide yay or nay? Like, is this a good idea? But
And
I
how
end
many
up doing
different
it
types
anyway.
have you grown? Or do you,
I've got a 12-way mixture of spring barleys growing, and then I've got Hunter, and then Irish Goldthorpe Sprat Archer, um, and then I have Galway Land Wheat. I've got a rye as well. But there's another very interesting thing actually about all of these, right? We can't trade those seeds with anyone else. Not as a viable seed, because basically the way the rules of Europe are set up right now, it says that these using trading these heritage grains would threaten food production in Europe. So therefore, it's illegal for me to give this seed to any other farmer. And basically, now I can keep it on the farm. I can grow it and process it, and I can keep the seed year to year. But basically, for every other farmer, you can't. You have to always go back to the seed company and get their seed and buy it. And like to me, it's like fundamentally, grain isn't something that we should own. Like our ancestors developed this grain. Like this has been developing for thousands of years. Do you know what I mean? So I just think it's such a like
Yeah,
I
that
get that seed development and varieties, there is a lot of important work, and I'm basically becoming a seed breeder, and there's an awful lot involved in it. But like, I just find those rules around the control that we're not allowed to trade them is mad. Do you know what I mean? Because like Waterford Distillery are developing a heritage grain, I'm developing heritage grain. We should be able to say, hey, do you want to try this and I'll try that and see how it works in Tipperary versus a different part of the country. But basically, you're not allowed to do it.
yes, I didn't realize that. That's yeah, that sounds kind of mad. It sounds though. I suppose some of it's coming from what people like Monsanto and their control over the
You said it, not me, Brian.
no, because I remember reading loads of things like how they were suing farmers. Their grains were going into the other farmers' fields, and then they'd sue them for
Yeah, yeah.
claiming that they were
It's a big
stealing.
issue. And people are like, oh, that's America. It's like, no, no, that's in Ireland,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. And yeah, guess who sits on the big boards of those for what grain is going to go in the
Yeah.
next year.
So that's what I love about the heritage grain is because I can keep the seed on our farm. And this is where to trade a grain, it needs to be a distinct variety. It needs to be uniform, stable, and distinct. Whereas that mixture basically is not stable because it's a mixture. It's not uniform because it's a mixture. And basically, it will adapt with the seasons. And crucially, what I want to do over the next 5 to 10 years is grow it in Tipperary. And theoretically, it should begin to evolve and adapt to Tipperary, to Northwest Tipperary, where we're growing it. So eventually I'll have my own variety basically, which will be of this area, do you know? So each farmer should be allowed to keep their own seed because if theoretically the grains that grow well on that farm will produce more seed. So if they keep growing that seed, they'll get adaptation. Whereas at the moment, commercially, we're getting seeds that are grown in south in France and then imported, and that's planted that we then have to plant out in our farm. It's like okay, it's grown in Ireland for 1 year, but like, why don't we have like this grain grown and continue to be grown in Ireland? Like, why, if we're going to develop an industry around Irish whiskey, Irish beer, Irish grain, why are we still depending on everything else? Now, for Monsanto, Ireland is a tiny market. They couldn't be bothered about having Irish planet. Do you know what I mean? But for Ireland, I think we should be paying attention to these things. Do you know?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It actually let's bring it back around to. I mean, it's obvious that you're doing this. It's not for the commercial reasons. I mean, you could be making a lot more money if you just went down the pure commercial.
Let me
There's
just
real
lock my
passion in it.
Rolls Royce here.
But like it is obviously for for both of you and for I mean Waterford Whiskey is a bigger organization, but for everybody there, it's obviously passion that you're doing it. But like the whole idea of local, like you said, is that where it's going to go? Like, is there a market? Is there a big enough market for people to say have individual farmers make their own beers and for you know distillers to work with individual farmers with heritage grains and their own terroir and that, and to like, do you think there's a growing market there? Obviously, it's not the big market, but is there a growing demand for that?
Well, I think it has been shown, especially in America, when it comes into craft beer industry, that was a movement that is not new at all. It might be new unto the Irish viewers, but it's not a new movement at all, and it has been tried and shown us that that is the way many communities are is kind of turning their eyes to. And when it comes into the distilling industry, I think people only now becoming more aware of things, and I think the whole everything that the Waterford Distillery has started doing, it is now people really paying attention that is there something else that we are not told? The likes of where the grains coming from. They are not Irish grain, the Irish whiskey, but by far being like probably a very small percentage being Irish, most of it being coming from all countries in the world. Ukraine now has, I think we got only a very tiny amount this year, but people before didn't even know where Ukraine was in the map prior to the war, but it's been the garden of Europe for many years in terms of grain supply, and that has definitely kind of put the industry into some sort of bother when it comes into extra grain. But in terms of Ireland, we produce amazing grains. I would even go far saying I think it is the best barley in the world, but we don't have enough for the industry. And then when you start to look into small producers and especially small breweries like that, I hope people start to see that, the uniformity of their product is not what it should matter. Because how can you do it uniformly when there is that whole terroir effect in that, the whole vintage effect into that? You couldn't possibly do it. Like when you go into looking into like the likes of Jack Daniels, I would hate to be a distiller there and having to always have the Jack Daniels exact the same. I don't know how they do it. I really don't, because
And why
everything is.
should we care? Like, to me, leave the big boys care about consistency, and they'll invest massive amounts to doing consistency. If we're small producers, let's celebrate variation, let's celebrate locality, and let's celebrate experience. And that's why we call ourselves Canvas Brewery, because each beer is its own thing. Do you know what I mean? It's not each year we're going to put the vintage of our grain, because we're using all our base malt is now heritage malt grown from the farm, right? And it's like each year will have its own. This year was very dry when we were harvesting. Each year will have its own signature that
Mm,
it'll come through the process. And yes, like if there's raspberries or a fruit in there, you're not going to notice the heritage grain. It's not going to be the dominant flavor, but it's getting to the point where I say this is the year the grain was produced, this is where it was from, and that's why this is a small produce. If you want to buy a mass market product, it exists, it's out there, it's on the shelf, and it's a competitively priced product, you know. But if you want something different, if you want to taste area, if you wanted, I actually use the Irish word counter, because it's the Irish word for surroundings. Because it's all those bits. It's the farmer, it's the soil, it's the weather, it's all those bits. Terroir is basically a French word, so why not bring it back to Irish with counter? Because it's about our surroundings. That's where, that's how the, like when you have one of our beers, it's all the surroundings. That's what's gone into the philosophy, the ethos. All those bits are what goes into making that taste like it is. You know?
and your farming practices.
Yeah, exactly.
But you have to be able to tell the story. You have to be able to put that down so people understand it.
2 lines in the bottom of the can, Brian. It covers it.
You have to include that article on you, the profile on you every time.
Yeah, yeah. No, and that's like
You can't get a bit.
when I give a tour to farm, like invariably, like it's an hour or 2 hours, because I'm like, look, you want to understand this? I'm gonna first bring you out into the fields, and I'm gonna explain the processes. This is what's normally done. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it, and then you bring it on into the malt house, into the brewery, and then you can see why this all steps up and makes somewhat sense.
And sorry, I was going to go. A lot of that just as you said, bringing tours, like how much of this is sellable to people in your locality, and how much is dependent on tourism? I mean, there seems to be a big thing that people are now they're going to whiskey tours, they're going visiting distilleries, going visiting breweries, and when you go somewhere, you want to experience that place, so you want something that's from there. So how much of that is kind of driving this effect, or rather than the person down the road from you just buying another Heineken or a Jack Daniels or something?
I think, well, COVID slowed it down basically in terms of tourism and stuff. But certainly, I do find people who come to visit the area end up like loving or really connecting with what's going on there. And I suppose that's easy because if you live in an area, you can kind of say, well, that's what it is and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, certainly, I think that is people who come and visit. They do want to say, okay, what's of the area? Do you know what I mean? can we go and engage with that? And to me, like it's a positive. The more people who come to visit Ireland and come say, hey, I want to go and visit Waterford, I want to go and visit here and do a tour of this, that's tourism. That helps accommodation, that helps local restaurants, that helps all of that stuff. That, like, the more that we can do, the better. Because that's, if we want to make Ireland into a brand that has, we grow amazing barley, we can make really good beverages from it, we should be saying, cool, come visit. Look, I'll show you. This is great barley. These are great barley growing conditions. This is what we produce. And therefore, go and buy it in another country as well, and think of
Yeah.
this experience of coming to see the place.
But
Yeah.
then there's also the point that people nowadays, they're all of a sudden stumbling with all those different words and things that are coming out of the industry, and all of a sudden they were like, oh, I didn't know that, so how do I go about knowing more? So having being able to have those experiences and going in and learning how different like such as breweries or distilleries, and see how the processes are made, it kind of evokes an appreciation for the product and the consumer. And then when there's that appreciation and they're understanding, they want to understand more. It's like, when I said about the terroir code in the back of the bottle, a person said to me a couple of months ago, in one of the events that I was doing, they're like, why would I want to look at the terroir code? And that's okay if you just want to drink, and whatever it is in front of you, or it's being served or recommended to you at the bar or whatever, it's fine. Beverages are made for drinking, and that's the whole purpose. But when you want to understand more about what you're drinking, then there's that appreciation. And I think there is the new era of people being more aware of the way things are produced and what goes into those processes. Then also becomes that kind of they just want to see, okay, so can I actually go and visit? And then when you go and visit, there's a whole new world being open right in front of you, and then there's rabbit holes that you can go in and they never come out.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
likes
And
of the heritage grains.
yeah, you come out 10 years later. The what I talk about is conscious consumption, right? Is that if you want to have a bland, uniform product, right, you don't need to be very conscious about what you're consuming. When you have something interesting and different, when you take a sip of it, you kind of go, ooh, what is that? And your mind has to process, what is it? What am I tasting? Why am I tasting it? And you kind of go through that process, because we always produce different beers. Even if it's the same beer, it'll be a different batch or a different year or a different barrel, so that each time it's like, okay, this is beer type, I'm expecting a red ale of certain with a barrel aging effect. But you still need to think and process, what is it, why is it, do I enjoy it, how do I enjoy it, where is it sitting on my palate? And that slows down your consumption, right? It's not about, maybe you don't want to care about it, grant. But if you want to get an interesting experience, it's there's more to it. Do you know what I mean? And that's what makes it. I don't know. That's what I'm interested in. If you just want to swill it and you want to buy our beer, it's expensive. Cool, go for it. It'll help me to do my stuff. But, like, most of the time it's about people who want an experience and they want to kind of think and challenge and help, create a happy time. Yeah, happy days.
And do you think that any of this is then, like, where are you selling it? I guess is my next question. Like, because you could sell it in, do you have to find kind of a specialist place where they'll explain what's happening, or can it be on the shelves of Tesco? Like, is there a
For
difference?
me, no, not in a supermarket. Local independent off licenses, things like that, craft beer places, and for me, that is what the tourism's very important for. Is because the more people who come and visit and see the place, then they understand and they're like, cool, I get it. Because there's a lot. It's a bit of a mouthful. There's a lot of different things that we do. The more people come and see the place, then they're like, I get it. I see what. And then we sell online. We sell through independent off licenses, stuff like that. I don't particularly want to be in large supermarkets. I don't think they're necessarily positive for our Irish agricultural scene. The large multiples are why we don't have vegetable producers in Ireland, because it's cheaper for them to import vegetables from Spain, or and then now we have war, and now we have food insecurity, and everyone's like, oh, why do we have no vegetable producers? Because they've been driven out. They make nothing, are working so hard trying to produce vegetables, and it's like, oh, why have you disappeared? It's like, well, because no one pays for vegetables. Like, everyone wants the cheapest possible thing. So, like, that's, yeah, I don't the more variety, and to me, the other thing, it's like, what sort of world do you want to live in, right? Do you want to support a local small producer that's looking after regenerative practices, looking after the soil, or do you want to buy mass market cheap stuff? Because invariably, you can't cry about farmers going out of business and retiring because they can produce them cheaper in Spain. And it's like, well, that's the world that you selected by continuously buying the lowest common denominator. That's we can only produce the cheapest. And that's, if you ask farmers, why do we farm this way? It's like, you gotta farm to stay. Like, it's still a business. It's your farm, it's your home, it's your livelihood, but you have to stay alive. You know what I mean? You have to make money, you have to try and produce. And if the industry is only purchasing a certain thing, that's what you have to go. Otherwise, you have to go a very different way. So that's, I think it is really exciting. The more small local producers, the more options there are for farmers to start producing. And there's a large push in agriculture towards organic. And the farmers are saying, well, who's going to buy our organic grain? Who's going to buy any of that? The more there's a market for it, the more farmers will go and produce that to fulfill that market. Do you know?
And so actually, yeah, so it sounds like a lot of the market is not. It's not going to be the individuals going out buying the organic grain to make their own flour at home or anything that you're talking about. It has to be through people like ye who have to. People will pay the extra money for a good whiskey, maybe, or a good beer, than they seem to be willing
Yeah,
to for a bag of
but
flour.
it should hopefully percolate. You should go and buy flour from local Irish mills because they'll ship it to your door. There's plenty of them who will grow Irish flour. And if you're making a sourdough or if you're making a soda bread, you can get great flour. And this is, I had a chat with someone and they were like, oh, I got diddled. I could buy like this Odlum's flour for really cheap. And it's like, yeah, but you're comparing Irish grown, freshly ground organic flour with Odlums, which is Ukrainian flour from like a year ago. Like, you got to recognize there is a different process, there is a different value, there is a different flavor in it. And yes, ideally it wouldn't be ridiculously expensive, but at the same time you do have to fucking like stay alive. Do you know what I mean? Like, that organic doesn't yield the same amount. It is going to be more expensive. So those are the trade-offs. You can get regenerative, you can get conservation, or you can buy organic, and some of it will cost more. Do you know what I mean? That's
Yeah.
just the way it is.
Yeah, no, it's just thinking like people are willing, if it's a luxury item, people are willing or classify it as, like a whiskey or a good beer. It's, people are willing to pay a little bit more for that, but they don't seem to be willing to pay for lower down the food chain, Or maybe I'm wrong, but that just seemed to be
Well,
seems to be.
hopefully they will at some point.
I personally think when it comes into the industry, it's like, I think it's great that they're kind of, it's almost like a ladder effect. You can go from your the first choice when you're learning how to drink whiskey, the likes of Jameson, that is there, is consistent, it tastes good. But then once you start to like and enjoy and have more appreciation and understanding, there's ladders that you go up. It can go for like 35 euros, then there's areas of 50, 60 euros, and then you go over to your more kind of luxury items where there's more input into production and different ways to do. They're not totally focused just on the yield of the whole thing, but there's so much more processes. And the same goes into beer. You can go in to the local supermarkets, the cheap supermarkets, and buy beer that start from 180. Again, it's like the same thing as you're saying about the flour. There, some come from Ukraine, and the Irish ones, it just it comes from an amalgamation of malt, a big pile, and then it's brewed and distilled really quick. There's no thoughts and care about that yeast, how it is exploiting that yeast, how flavor is it's yielding that product, because they need to produce something quick and cheap to have in the market. But again, it goes into the ladder system. It's people that just want to drink for the effects of the alcohol in their system, then they're going for the cheap booze. But then if people are drinking because there's an appreciation for what they're drinking, then they go into like the likes of craft beers, and their products that are, there's extra thoughts coming into it, and then it comes into the locality. You're supporting your communities, and the money that you're spending, it's coming back to your own community. It could go on to your own, back to your business, that the person that may be buying drink, or it stays in that area. And I think it's great, especially when it's craft beer. Like I often think that this is my view as not being on the craft beer industry, but I think it's like sometimes they just want to embrace the whole country. Yes, let's ship it to all the counties, and sometimes the own county don't know they exist. And it's great to have that kind of sense of belonging for people that are consuming, and say, oh, that is actually our craft beer, or we have 3 craft beers that we can choose from. Even better, you're supporting 3 different farmers from that community, and it's out in your local pub, and you have the choice to go for your traditional pint of Guinness, but you also have the on the tap, ready to go, fresh, selected, and then the mindfulness of that product, that the way you're minding your farm, minding your yeast and everything, it goes back into that same community. And that's like the awareness of your consumers, but also what level of consumption those clients are. If they're just the entry point, they're not interested how it tastes, they just want to get in the alcohol in them or not.
So I've had you just looking at the time there. You've been on an hour. You've given me over an hour of your time already. So maybe I'll just bring it back to the grains again. I mean, we've gone through the whole thing, but I know.
Philosophy. Let's go.
No, because what occurred to me is like what we're saying, like you've Morris been saying about that sometimes hops are the thing. Like beer has an awful lot of stuff that can overpower the grain, and there's only certain types of beers, maybe that certain styles, that the grain is the kind of the forefront. Obviously, in whiskey, it's much more the grain is front and center. But
I kind of disagree on that slightly, because without malt you can't make beer unless you're going to make wheat beer. And then if you make wheat beer and you can put all those there, you can have different strains of yeast and different type of hops. If you make that without a different raw material, it is not going to be the same. So that's where I think people keep focusing on other things, and the raw material, which is the larger proportion that goes into that, as well as water, which is another raw material that is super important and does have an effect. But without the malt, you can't have that. So that's, to me, I disagree in that. I think, yeah, you can put loads of different hops. Your raw material is still barley. If you're going to produce with another, if you're making out of corn or out of rye or out of wheat, it will be a different beer. So I think that's when we should think about back and think, barley is the king. And then yes, we can put a few embellishments around, and it can be changed and it can be manipulated, but without that, you're not making that beverage, you're making something else.
fair enough. Fair enough. That is a good point.
It's the soul. Without soul, it's got nothing.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what I was trying to get back to is, like, do you think there is more of a focus coming in on the grain? Because I see, just like in America particularly, I keep seeing them talk about new craft malters and stuff like that. So there seems to be more, not like throwing as many hops as you can and just making it a hop flavor, but there seems to
Yeah.
be some sort of recognition of.
No, and I think that it comes with development, that hops is a certain tool to create a certain flavor, and IPAs are great. We still brew some IPAs, but it's like, yeah, if you want to dive down into a different sort of level, like, and there is a trend towards lagers and stuff. And what's the dominant flavor in lager?
Yeah.
Beer, malt. Like, you're tasting barley. Like, that's what makes them so hard to brew. But like, I'm like, it's when I taste grain in the trailer, I'm like, it's what you're tasting, like it's barley. Like that's what it is, you know. Um, but yeah, no, and what I think was cool in the terroir story as well is people do, like, the industry does say no, terroir doesn't exist. Waterford gone out, done their paper, like shown how it exists, and that's true distillation all the way. Like, it's now, even still, the industry will complain about it, and they'll say, oh, they've changed this or they've changed that, and you're like, look, come on, like this, surely we should get to the point that we can all logically say this does exist, this is important. It doesn't benefit the large industry, I get that, but like, let's not deny that it doesn't exist, like, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know. There's been a huge amount of stuff there. I don't think I have any questions because they just overpowered me with information.
And
And
Brian, we only touched, the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more. This is
tell me
just
what,
like an introduction to
is there anything
terroir.
that we specifically should do before I let you kind of finish up, because I don't want to hold you all day. Is there anything specifically there that we didn't discuss that, like you said, some element of that affects the grain, or some element that affects some heritage grain that maybe should be mentioned that we haven't mentioned? Was there anything? No.
I don't think so. But if anyone watching have any questions, they can always email me. I'm sure you can also be reachable. But if there's any questions on that, I can be reached on my own email there at any time. I'll be very happy to answer. But at the moment, I don't think. I think we kind of covered. But it
Yeah,
has been
no.
a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's quite enlightening.
Good.
Yeah.
But
No,
no,
it's great fun, and the what I suppose the biggest thing is, like, for people to realize these rules around grains and genetics and stuff, and that's, I would love to set up a network of Irish grain growers, of people who are interested in these varieties and the work, because I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done on terroir, on nutritional quality, and all of these other things, and I think there's a huge story that needs to be told around these grains and why these grains have this flavor, that I think, I'm saying the same stuff as Waterford are saying. We should all start talking together and actually set up a little network around this to actually
yeah,
just
but,
help more people to realize what's going on,
but you won't be able to exchange the actual grains.
No.
until we change the rules.
Well, I think just
Waterford is actually setting up a platform. It's called the Herb Hub, which is with Dr. Dustin Herb. And we are open to people like yourself, Morris, all around the world to join these. This is going to be a platform, and hopefully we're going to, gather all this information and have a bit of extra, influence, and perhaps in the future some power to change some of the rules around. So it's a good one for you to keep an eye.
And when's that launching?
It will be launching soon. I think by the end of the year, but you can contact us. It will be a platform that you can access through the Waterford Distillery website.
Okay, sounds good. I did think of one question there now that I want to ask you. So, out of all these heritage grains and stuff, is there one that you like, that you've grown, that you've brought back to life, and you said, "Whoa, this is like nothing I've tasted before"?
I actually wasn't so much for the taste, but I was quite interested the way the sprout orchard was grown. Like even the way where the field that was grown has been sprayed. It's a commercial field, but some grains fell to the side of the field where it wasn't sprayed, and even the way it has grown was so different. It's just so tall. Like was like I'm not very tall myself, but it was like my height, and even like the structure of the plant, it was so different. And it is a breath of fresh air, really, to be able to have access. Even though it's so old, it's not a fresh air at all. It's just bringing it back. But it's great to see and compare visually, even, and to see why it's not being used. Could be, you know, as Morris explained earlier, in terms of the way the roots was attaching, or how much growth was being done, just kind of being more practical in terms of harvesting and growing and yield as well. But if visually, as a, you know, a plant biology, it's fantastic to even see those heritage grains. And because all the other ones, especially the modern varieties, are just so close together genetically. They're just bred from, you know, very close cousins, and then there is not a very huge variation in terms of visually, but therefore also they able to extract you know, nutrients and different things from the soil, which gives different flavor profile, which is brilliant.
Yeah, Morris, anything new?
Yeah, probably actually Sprat Archer and Irish Goldthorpe. They've just a very different head shape, and like when I grew them and saw the head, and I was like, "Oh, what the heck?" Now, that depends which seed bank you get them from as well. Different level of nuance, but like I was like, "Oh, that's a different barley." You know, like that's fundamentally different. Like I know that that's different. But like otherwise, they're like my children. Like I've got 6, 7, 8 varieties of different things growing that I'm like, give me a couple of years and I'll probably have a favorite maybe, but it'll but no, the mixtures is cool because like we're doing mixed fermentation beer, so getting mixtures into the field, getting diversity, that's all helping to get away from monoculture, and that's all helping carbon sequestration, resilience, drought tolerance. All of these things are cool stuff that, like, there's a lot of negativity around agriculture, but basically we can do a lot of cool stuff that yeah.
Yeah, needs a lot of. So you can do a lot of stuff on the farm, but you kind of pretty much have to keep it on the farm and use your product, or else find someone like Waterford who are willing
Yeah.
to go the extra step to work with you on it. But you're not going to be selling it out to the global markets.
Not yet.
All right, listen, guys. Yeah, this was I've got you for way too long, way beyond what I promised you. So thanks a million for the time. Really, really enjoyed it. Like I said, my head is kind of about to explode, I think, on some of the stuff. I go away later and I'll have about 50,000 questions. I'll say I should have had,
Yeah.
but you know, maybe I get you back
Great.
again sometime.
Yeah. Thanks very much for having us. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you,
Brilliant.
Barry, for having us. Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm not doing anything next week, but I do have I think it's 2 brewers. I have Birra de Mont from Italy and I have Fat Walrus from Dublin taking part in 2 weeks' time, just for a general chat. So hopefully we'll see some people for that. I'm just going to play out a little video here just to let it die out. And thanks again to everyone for taking part. It was a pleasure.